ora te whānau. How you doing? Oh, we've got so many people. You're all being forced to sit right next to each other. No space of a chair between you and the next person. It's good to see you all this morning. For those who I'm yet to meet, my name's Cameron. I'm the lead pastor here at Village Baptist. And joining me this morning is Annedien. And Annedien is one of the key ministry leaders here at Village Baptist, who alongside the wider GAT team oversee various ministry partnerships that support global missions. But one thing I love about Annedien is that between being well-grounded and her Dutch heritage, you can have really good conversations, robust conversations with her. You don't have to try and sandwich things or to make things palatable by watering them down. You can just say the thing and have a good, forthright and honest conversation. And good, honest conversations is something that we can all benefit from. Because at some point in our lives, we'll all have thoughts and questions that will arise and will pester us or prod us, but which we might feel unable to share and so unable to resolve. And at some point, we'll all encounter people who also hold differing beliefs from us, people who are also willing to share them in a direct and forthright way. So for our own sake, to resolve those pestering thoughts and to steady ourselves so when we face those inevitable objections, forthright conversations with trusted conversation partners can be healthy and even freeing. Annedien is someone I trust with these kinds of conversations. And so this morning, I want to bring that kind of a conversation into our service together. I want to chat about the big claims of Jesus' resurrection. I want to be honest about the questions that can surface in our minds or in the comment sections of social media posts. I want to prod those claims in direct and forthright ways so that we can leave with greater confidence. Confidence through resolving the questions that might be pestering us. Confidence by reminding ourselves of the robustness of the Christian faith. And confidence that comes from understanding what all of this means for you. What it means for the ordinariness of everyday life and the highs and lows that accompany it. So, Annedien, thank you for joining me this morning. Before we dive into some uncomfortable questions, is there anything more that you'd like to say or add?
I think I want to maybe just follow on a little bit to your comments that you had there about questions, because you're right. Questioning is something that we just do all the time, right? We do it with our parents, with our family members, with our brothers, our sisters, our friends, our co-workers. And why do we do that? Because we want to learn, don't we? We want to understand something better. We want to understand a situation better. Ultimately, questioning is about seeking the truth. Well, what is the truth? Well, we get to the truth by asking the questions. So I don't actually ever think there needs to be an uncomfortable question, because I think if you ask questions and approach them with curiosity and humility, they can actually be quite healthy. And this is particularly true of faith. Christianity has never been afraid of questions because it's grounded in real events within history. We can test it, we can examine it, we can look at the evidence for it. And I have a feeling that in a room this size, there are people here who have had these kinds of questions. There are probably still people who do. And I think if that's you, you're in really good company today. So I'm really glad we're having this conversation today, because I think if you ask the good questions, to your point, and you look at the evidence, it can actually strengthen your confidence in what you believe in rather than weaken it. So, just that thought there.
It's great. It actually reminds me of a defining experience that I had as a child where I asked my dad a question, and I think I was a bit apologetic about asking it. And he said, Cam, you never need to apologise for asking a question, because that's how we learn.
Yes, exactly.
So I like to think that that's how we roll here at Village Baptist. But, all right. Well, here's a question for you then. So Jesus and the resurrection, it's just another myth, right? It's just another old made-up story, because throughout the ancient world, there are mythical stories about the gods, some involving, God-human hybrids like Hercules, other involving kind of death and resurrection like Osiris. So So Jesus isn't really a person, right? We just got another myth here. Or at least if he did exist, the stories become so distorted over time, so mythologized that we couldn't possibly know what Jesus was like or what he did, including rising from the dead. That's what we're dealing with here with the death and resurrection of Jesus, right?
Surprisingly, that is a really common objection. There's all these religions and worldviews out there, an ancient world full of gods and heroes, and, Jesus is just another version of that. I said surprisingly, though. And I say that because, as I mentioned, Christianity doesn't come from fables or passed down legends. It's grounded in real events within history. So when historians and scholars, come to look at the life of Jesus and the evidence for him, they treat him very differently than these mythological figures you just mentioned. And that's because the evidence for him is so substantial. We have over 40 historical sources, independent and dependent sources that reference Jesus' life, his death, and his resurrection. 40. And what I mean by historical sources is any document or record or inscription that gives us information about a person or an event or a time in the past. We have historical records and sources about the life of Abraham Lincoln, right? The events that happened at 9/11. We have historical documents on the founding of New Zealand. We weren't there. And so we need to look at these documents and these sources to give us the information of what happened and help us to get to the truth. And we don't have time today, so I can't go over the whole list, but there's over 40 for Jesus. And the remarkable thing with that is that Jesus wasn't some political ruler or some wealthy leader. He was a carpenter from some remote corner in the Roman Empire. And yet he's mentioned in more sources than Tiberius, who was emperor at the time. I think there's like 4 or 6 sources for him. We all know who Alexander the Great is, right? We've heard about him, we've read about him, we've probably watched a couple of movies around him. You know how we know about him and his life? Through 5 historical sources and documents and records. 5. Julius Caesar, another classical figure. Again, 5 sources. Socrates, father of philosophy. We got 3 sources for him. Jesus, we have over 40 historical sources. Oh no, he's a myth, he didn't exist. What? Right. Really?
Okay, take it back.
I'd have to question someone's, historical methodology there, because if someone was to say that, they would get laughed out at any major university if they say that Jesus didn't exist. And this is not just Christian sources or biblical sources, mind. That is 110% valid. But there's also non-Christian references as well to the life of Jesus. And when historians take all that together, it's very apparent, Jesus of Nazareth lived in the 1st century AD. He was crucified and he died under Roman authority, and he rose from the dead. And this is one of these good questions to ask, by the way, because myths, they come up and they grow up in vague times and places. They're not anchored to specific people or specific events or historical records. Jesus is. He's deeply tied to verifiable history. Real political leaders, real places, real events. So, no, I don't think Jesus is a myth. No, he existed, and, he still does.
So I take your point that there's good reason to believe that Jesus was a real person. There's, from what the examples you gave, 10 times the number of documents compared to much more classically significant figures, I guess, like Tiberius from the time. I take your point there, but maybe we just slow down a little bit on your confidence about the resurrection. Because it's one thing that he existed, it's another thing that he rose from the dead, because, maybe he just never actually died in the first place, right? Because you've heard of the phrase, saved by the bell? Have you heard, the phrase, saved by the bell, and its origins with premature burial? There's a time when due to things like extreme intoxication, that people were mistakenly treated as dead, and so they were wrongly buried. So to ensure that those people could be saved, they'd tie a little string to one of their limbs, their hands, or their feet, which would then be attached to a bell on the surface, so that if they did come to in the casket that were after being buried, they'd ring the bell, and the person who's working the graveyard shift would then come to their rescue. So there's historical precedent for people being mistakenly treated as deceased. Yes, so for all we know, exactly the same is true from Jesus. That he didn't so much die and rise, but like fainted or blacked out or something like that, and then woke up a bit later, like the guys in the caskets. Yeah?
Yeah, that's a fun question. Because it highlights, I think, the defining difference that exists between Christianity and all other worldviews that are out there. Many people will say, aren't all religions just fundamentally the same and it's superficially there's, some differences? No. At best, there are some superficial similarities, but they are fundamentally different. And the difference lies in the claims made about Jesus. You just take the three major monotheistic faiths that are out there, yeah? Christianity claims that Jesus died and rose from the dead, right? That's one. Judaism claims that he died, but he didn't rise. He stayed dead. Islam claims that he never died. Well, they can't all be true, can they? And so this idea that Jesus, swooned or fainted or, didn't die or appeared to be dead, that's been around for a while. But when historians come and scholars come and they analyze these sources that I mentioned and take in some context and look at this and investigate this, the idea that Jesus didn't die is, it's historically and I think it's medically and even psychologically just implausible. And I'm going to briefly mention on those three because I do want to say something to the resurrection, but just briefly on these points for a moment. It is historically implausible that Jesus didn't die. What do I mean by that? If you look at the Roman Empire and you read up about Roman history and what life was like back then, Roman executioners were professionals, yeah? Crucifixion was designed for death. So if a Roman guard let a person survive a crucifixion, the penalty for that was usually his own death, his own execution, which actually leads nicely into the medical implausibility of it. So, these guards are being real sure that this guy is dead before they come off the cross, right? So that medical implausibility here now for a second. Sources tell us that when Jesus, or before Jesus was crucified, he endured a beating, but he also endured a Roman scourging or a flogging. Google this stuff. This was brutal. That alone would have killed a man. So now we've got Jesus with severe blood loss, extreme dehydration, and then add to that the physical trauma of the crucifixion itself. On top of that, the Roman guards at one point came to the cross to check if Jesus had died. Either the professionals got to check he's dead. Now, how do you do that when he's up there and you're on the ground? And what they did back then and what they did with Jesus to ensure that he was dead is they drove a spear into his side, right? And sources tell us that blood and water poured out at the same time, as that was one of the ways medically that they could determine that someone was indeed dead. And that happened to Jesus. So for him to survive all of that is just unrealistic. But also just on the psychological side of this, okay, let's just say Jesus did survive all of that and they accidentally buried him in a grave. Now he comes crawling out of that grave. He's half dead, severely wounded, desperate need of medical attention. I don't think that would have convinced the disciples that he had conquered death, If anything, I think it would have invoked a level of, pity or sympathy or wanting to care for him, not declare him the risen Lord. So historians take all of that and all that context and they bring that all together and they look at that and, the idea that he survived that is just, no, he died. That is of historical certainty that he died, and historians and scholars agree to that fact. But just on the resurrection for a minute, yeah, there's this fact that he died, but there's also these other facts that historians and scholars widely agree upon. The first fact is that he died, okay? Second fact is that he was buried in a tomb by Joseph of Arimathea. The third fact is that 3 days later, they came to that tomb, the tomb was empty. Body's gone. Where's the body? No one knows. And then the fourth fact is that after these events, people and groups of people started saying that they had seen Jesus alive, physically alive. One source actually says 500 people at one time saw him alive. And so what we do now is we take these facts and we put them together and we look at them in totality and we say, okay, now what is the best explanation for these facts? And that's where the contention lies. Historians will say, yes, we agree on these facts. These are things that happened, historical certainty, yes, something remarkable must have happened. But we can't really explain it, and so they claim agnosticism and say, well, we don't know. But if we just look at these facts without bias, a death, a burial, an empty tomb, and the appearances of Jesus after these events, the best explanation for the facts is the claim that Christianity has been made from the very beginning, and that's that Jesus rose from the dead. So I just want to mention that because, yeah, there's this fact about his death, fine, but there's also these other facts as well that actually give strong evidence and strengthen the evidence towards his resurrection as well.
So you're saying that the Christian claims of the resurrection makes best sense of the evidence, but does it though? Because many of us will have experienced the pain of public shame, and some of us may have even acted to avoid that feeling of shame by covering up our failures, whatever that cover up might have looked like. These disciples in the context there, and they left everything to follow Jesus, including their livelihood and extended families. For them to return home after all of this would have involved significant shame of having given everything up for what had proven to be a false and now crucified Messiah. And that kind of shame can cause people to act in uncharacteristic ways, like stealing a body and fabricating a story. So that seems plausible, and we can even be sympathetic towards the disciples and the situation they found themselves in. So, what about that?
Yeah, the idea of stolen bodies and whatnot. What we're probably stepping into here now is what's called the minimal facts argument. And what I mean by that is when historians come to look at the life for Jesus and the evidence for his resurrection, there's actually only a handful of facts out of those 40 sources and documents that I mentioned, a handful of facts that the New Testament scholars widely agree upon. Those facts are really the only ones they'll specifically look at. Now, I've mentioned a few of them, okay? We've got the death, we have a burial, the empty tomb, and the appearances of Jesus after these events. But there's actually another fact that historians and scholars widely agree upon, and that is that the disciples genuinely and sincerely believed that Jesus had risen from the dead. And this is where the idea of a stolen body theory or any fabrication theory really starts to run into some rocky grounds, because it doesn't adequately explain all those facts. For example, it doesn't explain the appearances. Even if the disciples had stolen the body of Jesus, okay, fine. That might explain the fact of the empty tomb. But what it doesn't explain is why people and groups of people saw Jesus and reported seeing Jesus alive, physically alive, after those events. On top of that, you've also got to start thinking about the fact that everything we've talked about here up until this point, crucifixions and deaths and, stolen bodies and all this kind of stuff, all of this went completely against the disciples' preconceived beliefs that they held at the time. And let me just explain that for a second. We've got to remember here that the disciples, these men, they were first century Jewish men. And here's their reality. Their leader is dead. And Jewish messianic beliefs involved no idea of a dying, much less rising Messiah. Messiah was supposed to throw off Israel's enemies, which in this case was Rome, and reestablish David's throne in Jerusalem, not die at their hand this brutal and bloody death. And on top of that, according to their own law, someone who was crucified was seen to be cursed by God. So now they're dealing with a dead leader who is literally accursed by God. If they're making something up, they're not making up a crucified and risen Messiah, because that went completely against their worldview. And historians and scholars look at this kind of thing, and they also point out the fact that the disciples' behavior doesn't fit deliberate fabrication. Again, Jesus is dead, yeah? And the disciples, they didn't have hindsight. All they know is their leader is dead. He's completely cursed by God because he got crucified. They've been following a heretic for the last 3-4 years. And sources tell us that they panic, they flee, they scatter, they're out of Jerusalem, they're gone. But then shortly after that, they come walking back into Jerusalem, declaring that he's risen from the dead and that he's the Messiah. Even though that message brought them persecution and suffering, and for many of them, early death. A lot of them were martyred for that message.